But we are currently reading the Belgariad, which is by David Eddings. It is a 5-book series, and then it has a second series called the Belgariad, which is another 5 books. We are currently in chapter 6 of Belgariad, the first book, Pawn of Prophecy. Sorry, I'm being my squirrel brain shiny. Squirrel brain shiny over here. Yeah. We are in chapter 6. And do let me know if the music is too loud or anything. But yeah, we are gonna dive into chapter 6. Chapter 6. They had walked for miles. How many Garon could not say. He nodded as he walked, and sometimes stumbled over unseen stones on the dark road. More than anything, now he wanted to sleep. His eyes burned and his legs trembled on the verge of exhaustion. Atop another hill, there was Kendall. Top another hill, there has always seemed to be another hill, for the part of Cinderia was folded like a rumpled cloth. Mr. Wolf stopped and looked about, his eyes searching the oppressive gloom. We turn aside from the road here, he announced. Is that right? Durkin asked. There are woods about, and I have heard that there may be robbers hiding in there. Even if there aren't robbers, we aren't likely to lose our way in the dark. He looked up at the murky sky, his plain face dimly seen, troubled. I wish there was a moon. Hello! Okay. I don't think we need to be afraid of robbers, Mr. Wolf said confidently, and I am just as happy that there isn't any moon. I don't think we've been followed yet, but this is just as well that no one happens to see us pass. Morgul gold can buy most secrets. And with that, he led them into the fields that lay beside the road. For Garon, the fields were impossible. If he had stumbled now and then on the road, the unseen furrows, holes, and clumps in the rough ground seemed to catch at his feet with every step. At the end of a mile, when they had reached the black edge of the woods, he had almost ready to weep with exhaustion. How can we find our way in there? He demanded, peering into the utter darkness of the woods. There's a woodcutter's track not far to this side, Wolf said, pointing. We have only a little farther to go. And he set off again, following the edges of the dark woods, with Garon and the others stumbling along behind him. Here we are, he said finally, allowing them to catch up. It's going to be very dark in there, and the track isn't wide. I'll go first, and the rest of you follow me. I'll be right behind you, Garon, Durkin said. Don't worry, everything is going to be all right. There was a note in the smith's voice, however, that hinted that his words were more to reassure himself than to calm the boy. It seemed warmer in the woods. The trees sheltered them from the gusty wind. But it is so dark that Garon could not understand how Wolf could possibly find his way. A dreadful suspicion grew in his mind that Wolf actually didn't know where he was going and was merely floundering along blindly, trusting to luck. Stop, a rumbling voice, suddenly, shockingly, it said directly ahead of them. Garon's eyes, accustomed slightly now to the gloom of the woods, saw a vague outline of something so huge that it could not possibly be a man. A giant, he screamed in a sudden panic. Then, because he was exhausted and because everything that had happened that evening had simply piled too much on him all at one time, his nerves broke and he bolted in the trees. "Garon!" Aunt Paul cried out for him. "Come back!" But panic had taken a hold of him. He ran on, falling over roots and bushes, crashing into trees and tangling his legs into brambles. It seemed like some endless nightmare of blind flight. He ran full tilt into a low-hanging, unseen branch, and sparks flared before his eyes with a sudden blow to his forehead. He lay in the damp earth, grasping and sobbing, trying to clear his head. And then there was hands on him, horrid, unseen hand. 1,000 terrors flashed through his mind at once, and he struggled desperately, trying to draw his dagger. "Oh no," a voice said. "None of that, my rabbit." His dagger was taken from him. "Are you going to eat me?" Garon babbled, his voice breaking. His captor laughed. "On your feet, rabbit," he said, and Garon felt himself pulled up by a strong hand. His arm was taken into a firm grasp, and he was half dragged through the woods. Somewhere ahead there was a light, a winking fire among the trees, and it seemed that he was being taken that way. He knew that he must think, must devise some means of escape, but his mind, stunned by fright and exhaustion, refused to function. There were 3 wagons sitting in a rough circle around the fire. Durkin was there, and Wolf and Aunt Paul, and with them a man so huge that Garon's mind simply refused to accept the possibility that he was real. His tree-trunk-sized legs were wrapped in fur crossed with leather thongs, and he wore a chainmail shirt that reached to his knees, belted at the waist. From the belt hung a ponderous axe on one side and a short-handled axe on the other. His hair was in braids, and he had a vast, bristling red beard. As they came into the light, Garon was able to see the man that captured him. He was a small man, scarcely taller than Garon himself, and his face was dominated by a long, pointy nose. His eyes were small and squinted, and his straight black hair was raggedly cut. The face was not that would sort of inspire confidence, and the man's stained and patched tunic and short, wicked, long sword did little to conjure the implications of the face. "Here's our rabbit," the small weasel-like man announced, as he pulled Garon into the circle of the firelight. "And a merry chase he led me, too." Aunt Paul was furious. "Don't you ever do that again," she said sternly to Garon. "Not so quick, Mrs. Prawl," Wolf said. "It is better for him to run than to fight just yet. Until he's bigger, his feet are his best friend." "Have we been captured by robbers?" Garon asked in a quivering voice. "Robbers?" Wolf laughed. "What a wild imagination you have, boy. These 2 are our friends." "Friends?" Garon said doubtfully, looking suspiciously at the red-bearded giant and the weasel-faced man beside him. "Are you sure?" The giant laughed then, too, his voice rumbling like an earthquake. "This boy seems mistrustful," he boomed. "Your face must have warned him, friend Silk." The small man looked sourly at his burly companion. "This is Garon," Wolf said, pointing at the boy. "You already know Mrs. Prawl." His voice seemed to stress Aunt Paul's name. "And this is Durkin, a brave smith who has decided to accompany him." "Mistress Paul," the smaller man said, laughing suddenly for no apparent reason. "I am known as so," Aunt Paul said pointedly. "It shall be my pleasure to call you so then, great lady," the small man said with a mocking bow. "Our large friend here is Bark," Wolf went on. "He is useful to have around when there's trouble. And as you can see, he is not Sindera. He is Cherokee of Val Aron." Garon had never seen a Cherokee before, and the fearful tales of their prowess in battle became quite suddenly believable in the presence of the towering Barak. "And I," the small man said, on one hand to his chest, "am called Silk. Not much of a name, I'll admit, but one which suits me, and I am from Bakatar and Dasanar. I am a juggler and an acrobat, and also a thief and spy," Barak rumbled good-naturedly. "We all have our faults," Silk admitted blandly, scratching at his scraggly whiskers. "And I am called Mr. Wolf in this particular time and place," the old man said. "I'm rather fond of the name since the boy gave it to me." "Mr. Wolf?" Silk asked, and then he laughed again. "What a merry name for you, old friend." I'm delighted that you find it so, old friend, Wolf said flatly. Mr. Wolf it shall be then, Silk said. Come to the fire, friends, warm yourselves, and I'll go see to some food. Garen was still uncertain about the oddly matched pair. They were obviously new Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf, and just obviously by different names. The fact that Aunt Paul might not be whom he had always thought she was very disturbing. On the foundation stones of his entire life had just disappeared. The food which Silk brought was rough, a turnip stew with thick chunks of meat floating in it and a crudely hacked off slabs of bread, but Garon, amazed by the size of his appetite, fell into it as if he had not eaten for days. And then his stomach full and his feet warmed by the crackling campfire, he sat in a log, half dozing. What now, old wolf? He heard Aunt Paul ask. What is the idea behind these clumsy wagons? A brilliant plan, Wolf said, even if I do say so myself. There are, as you know, wagons going every which way in Sindarian at this time of year. Harvests are moving from field to field, from farm to village, and from village to town. Nothing is more unremarkable in Sindarian than wagons. They are so common they are almost invisible. This is how we are going to travel. Wolf, we are now honest freight haulers. We're what? Aunt Paul demanded. Wagoners. Wolf said expensively. Hard-working transporters of the good Sindarian out to make our fortune and seek adventure. Bitten by the desire to travel, incorrigible, infected by the romance of the road. Have you any idea how long it takes to travel by wagon? Aunt Paul asked. 6 to 10 leagues in a day, he told her. Slow? I'll grant you. But it's better to move slowly than to attract attention. She shook her head in disgust. Where first, Mr. Wolf? Silk asked. To Denaria, Wolf announced. If the one we're following went to the north, he will have to pass through Denarian on his way to Boktar and beyond. And where exactly are we carrying to Denaria? Aunt Paul asked. Turnips, great lady, Silk said. Last morning, my large friend and I purchased 3 wagon loads of them in the village of Winwold. Turnips? Aunt Paul asked in a tone that spoke volumes. Yes, great lady. Turnips, Silk said solemnly. Are we ready then? Wolf asked. We are. The giant bar said shortly, raising with his mail shirt clinking. We should look the part, Wolf said carefully, eyeing Bark up and down. Your armor, my friend, is not the sort of garb an honest wagoner would wear. I think you should change it for stout wool. Bark's face looked injured. I could wear a tunic over it, he suggested tentatively. You rattle, Silk pointed out. And armor has a distinct fragrance about it. From the downward wind, you smell like a rusty ironworks barrack. I feel undressed without a mail shirt, Barrack complained. We all must make sacrifices, Silk said. Grumbling, Barrack went into one of the wagons, jerked out a bundle of clothes, and began to pull off his mail shirt. His linen undertook bore large reddish stains. I changed tunics as well, Silk suggested. Your shirt smells as bad as the armor. Barrack glowered at him. Anything else? He demanded. I hope for decency's sake you don't plan to strip me entirely. Silk laughed. Barrack pulled off his tunic. His torso was enormous and covered with thick red hair. You look like a rug, Silk observed. I can't help that, Barrack said. Winters are cold in Sherrick, and the hair helps me to stay warm. He put on a fresh tunic. It's just as cold in Denaria, Silk said. And you are absolutely sure your grandmother didn't dally with the bear during one of those long winters? Someday your mouth is going to get you into a great deal of trouble, friend Silk, Barrack said ominously. Silk laughed again. I've been in trouble most of my life, friend Barrack. I wonder why, Barrack said ironically. I think all this can be discussed later, Wolf said pointedly. I'd rather like to be away from here before the week's out, if I can. Of course, old friend, Silk said, jumping up. Barrack and I can amuse each other later. The 3 teams of sturdy horses were picketed nearby, and they all helped to harness them to the wagons. I'll put out the fire, Silk said, and fetched 2 pails of water from a small brook that trickled nearby. The fire hissed when the water struck it, and great clouds of steam boiled up towards the low-hanging tree limbs. We'll lead the horses to the edge of the wood. I'd rather not, Wolf said. I'd rather not pick my teeth on low branches. The horses seemed almost eager to started moving without urging along a narrow track through the dark woods. They stopped at the edge of the open fields, and Wolf looked around carefully to see if anyone was in sight. I don't see anybody, he said. Let's get moving. Ride with me, good smith, Beric said to Durkin. Conversation with an honest man is much more preferable to a night spent enduring the insults of an overly careful Disarnian. As you wish, friend, Durkin said politely. I'll lead, Silk said. I'm familiar with the back roads and lanes hereabouts. I'll put us on the high road beyond Upper Gault before noon. Beric and Durkin can bring up the rear. I'm sure that between them they can discourage anyone who might feel like following us. All right, Wolf said, climbing onto the seat of the middle wagon. He reached down his hand and helped Aunt Paul. Garen quickly climbed up onto the wagon bed behind them, a trifle nervous that someone might suggest that he ride with Silk. It was all very well for Mr. Wolf to say that the two of them had just were friends, but the fright he had suffered in the woods were still too fresh in his mind to make him quite comfortable with them. The sacks of musty-smelling turnips were lumpy, but Garon soon managed to push and shove a kind of half-reclining seat for himself among them just behind Aunt Paul and Mr. Wolf. He was sheltered from the wind, Aunt Paul was close, and his cloak spread over him kept him warm. He was, although comfortable, and despite the excitement of the night's events, he soon drifted into a half-drowse. The dry voice in his mind suggested briefly that he had not behaved too well back in the woods, but it soon too fell silent, and Garon slept. What works? Hi, Blat! Your phone hates you for what? Notch out. Yes. Have you been trying to get into stream this whole time, hun? I couldn't get a signal. Ah. It was a change in the sound that woke him. The soft thud of the horses' hooves on the dirt road became a clatter as they came to the cobblestones of a small village sleeping in the last chill hours of the autumn night. Garon opened his eyes and looked sleepily at the tall, narrow houses with their tiny windows all dark. A dog barked briefly, then retreated back to his warm place under some stairs. Garon wondered what village it might be and how many people slept under those steep peat tile roofs, unaware of the passage of the three wagons. The cobbled street was very narrow, and Garon could almost reach out and touch the weathered stones of the houses as they passed. And then the nameless village was behind them, and they were back on the road again. The soft sound of horse hooves lured him once more towards sleep. What if he hasn't passed through Denarian? Aunt Paul asked Mr. Wolf in a low tone. It occurred to Garon that in all the excitement, he had never actually found out what exactly it was they were seeking. He kept his eyes closed and listened. Don't start with the what-ifs, Wolf said irritably. If we sit around what-ifing, we'll never do anything. I was merely asking, Aunt Paul said. If he hadn't gone through Denarian, we'll turn south to Moros. He may have joined a caravan there to take the Great North to Bartok. And if he hasn't gone through Moros, then we'll go to Camir. And then we will see when we get to Camir. His tone was final, as if he no longer wished to discuss the matter. Aunt Paul drew a breath as if she was about to deliver some final retort, but apparently she decided against it and settled back instead on the wagon seat. To the east ahead of them, the faint stain of dawn touched the lowering clouds, and they moved on through the tattered, wind-swept end of the long night, in their search for something which, though he could not yet identify it, was so important that Garon's life had entirely been uprooted in a single day because of it. Chapter 7. It took them 4 days to reach Denarian on the north coast. The first day went quite well, since, though it was cloudy and the wind kept blowing, the air was dry and the roads were good. They passed quiet farmsteads, and an occasional farmer bent into his labor in the middle of a field. Inevitably, each man stopped his work to watch them pass. Some waved, but some didn't. And then there were the villages, clusters of tall houses nestled in the valleys. As they passed, the children came out and ran after the wagons, shouting with excitement. The villagers watched, idly curious, until it became obvious that the wagons were not going to stop, and then they sniffed and went back to their own concerns. As afternoon for the first day lowered towards evening, Silk led them into a grove of trees at the roadside, and they made preparations for the night. They ate the last of the ham and cheese Wolf had flinched from Falder's pantry, and spread their blankets on the ground beneath the wagons. The ground was hard and cold, but the exciting sense of being on some great adventure helped Garon to endure the discomfort. The next morning, however, it began to rain. It was a fine misty rain, at first scattering before the wind, but as the morning wore on, it settled into a steady drizzle. The musty smell of the turnips in their wet sacks became stronger, and Garon huddled miserably with his cloak pulled tightly around him. The adventure was growing much less exciting. The road became muddy and slick, and the horses struggled their way up each hill and had to be rested often. On the first day, they had covered 8 leagues. After that, they were lucky to make 5. Aunt Paul became whippish and short-tempered. "This is idiocy," she said to Mr. Wolf about noon on the 3rd day. "Everything is idiocy if you choose to look at it in the proper light," he replied, philosophy. "Why wagoners?" she demanded. "There are faster ways to travel with the family in a proper carriage, for instance, or imperial messengers on good horses. Either way, they would have put us in Danern by now, and left a trail in the memories of all the simple people we passed so wide that even a Thul could follow it." Wolf explained patiently. "Brill has long since reported our departure to his employers. Every Margot in Sindarian is looking for us by now." "Why are we hiding from the Margos, Mr. Wolf?" Garon asked, hesitant to interrupt, but impelled by a curiosity to try to penetrate the mystery behind their flight. "Aren't they just merchants like the Tondarians and the Desarians? The Margos have no interest in trade," Wolf explained. "Nadarkians are merchants, but the Margoros are warriors. The Margos pose as merchants for the same reason that we pose as wagoneers, so that they can move about more or less undetected. If you simply assumed that all Margos are spies, you wouldn't be too far from the truth." Haven't you anything better to do than ask all these questions?" Aunt Paul asked. "Not really," Garon said, and then instantly knew that he made a mistake. "Good," she said. "In the back of Baron's Bark's wagon, you'll find the dirty dishes from this morning's meal. You'll also find a bucket. Fetch the bucket and run to the stream ahead for water, and then return to Barrick's carriage wagon and wash the dishes." "And cold water," he objected. "Now, Garon," she said firmly. Grumbling, he climbed down off the slow-moving wagon. In the late afternoon on the 4th day, they came over a high hilltop and saw below the city of Darien, and beyond the city lay the leaden gray sea. Garon caught his breath. To his eyes, the city looked very large. Its surrounding walls were thick and high, and there were more buildings within those walls than he had ever seen in all his life. But it was the sea that his eyes were drawn to. There was a sharp tang in the air. Faint hints to the smell had been coming to him on the wind for the past league or so, but now inhaling deeply, he breathed in the perfume from the sea for the first time in his life. His spirit soared. "Finally," Aunt Paul said. Silk had stopped the lead wagon and came walking back. His hood was pulled back slightly, and the rain ran down his long nose to drip from the pointed tip. "Do we stop here or go down into the city?" he asked. "We go to the city," Aunt Paul said. "I'm not going to sleep under a wagon when they're in so close at hand." "Honest wagoners would seek out an inn," Mr. Wolf agreed, "and a warm tap room." "I might have guessed that," Aunt Paul said. We have to try to look the part," Wolf shrugged. They went down on the hill, their horses' hooves slipping and sliding as they braced back against the weight of the wagons. The city gate, 2 watchmen in stained tunics and wearing rusted spot helmets, came to the tiny watch house just inside the gate. "What is your business in Denaria?" one of them asked Silk. "I am Amber of Kartar. Silk lied pleasantly. A poor, desired merchant hoping to do business in your splendid city. Splendid, said one of the watchmen. What have you in your wagons, merchant? The other inquired. Turnips, Silk said dispassionately. My family has been in the spice trade for generations, but I am reduced to peddling turnips. He sighed. The world is a topsy-turvy place, is it not, good friend? We are obligated to inspect your wagons, the watchman said. I'll take some time, I'm afraid. I know what time at that, Silk said, squinting up the rain. It would be much more pleasant to devote the time to weddings one inside in some friendly tavern. That is difficult when one doesn't have much money, the watchman suggested hopefully. I am more than pleased if you accept some small token of friendship from me to aid you in your wedding, Silk offered. You are most kind, replied the watchman with a slight bow. Some coins changed hands, and the wagons moved into the city uninspected. From the hilltop, Denarian looked quite splendid, but Garon found it much less so as they clattered through the wet streets. The buildings all seemed the same, with the same self-important aloofness about them, and the streets were littered and dirty. The salt tang of the sea were tainted here with the smell of dead fish, and the faces of people hurrying along were grim and unfriendly. Garon's first excitement began to fade. Why are all the people here so unhappy? He asked Mr. Wolf. They have a stern and demanding god, Wolf replied. Which god is that? Garon asked. Money, Wolf said. Money is a worse god than Torok himself. Don't fill the boy's head with nonsense, Aunt Paul said. The people aren't really unhappy, Garon. They're just all in a hurry. They have important affairs to attend to, and they're afraid that they'll be late. That is all. I don't think I'd like to live here, Garon said. It seems like a bleak, unfriendly place. He sighed. Sometimes I wish we were all back at Faldor's farm. There are worse places than Faldor's, Wolf agreed. The inn Silk chose for them was near the docks, and the smell of the sea and rank detritus of the meeting of sea and land were strong there. The inn, however, was a stout building with stables attached and storage sheds for the wagons. Like most inns, the main floor was given over to the kitchen and a large common room with its rows of tables and large fireplaces. The upper floor was provided sleeping rooms for the guest. It is a suitable place, Silk announced as he came back out of the wagons after speaking at some length with the innkeeper. The kitchen seems clean, and I saw no bugs when I inspected the sleeping chambers. I will inspect it, Aunt Paul said, climbing down from the wagon. As you wish, great lady, Silk said with a polite bow. Aunt Paul's inspection took much longer than Silk's, and it was nearly dark when she returned to the courtyard. Adequate, she sniffed, but only barely. It is not as if we plan to settle in for the winter, Paul, Wolf said. At most, we'll only be here for a few days. She ignored that. I've ordered hot water sent to our chambers, she announced. I'll take the boy up and wash him while you and the others see to the wagons and horses. Come along, Garon, she said, and she turned and went back into the inn. Garon wished fervently that they would all stop referring to him as the boy. He did, after all, he reflected, have a name, and it was not that difficult of a name to remember. He was gloomily convinced that even if he lived to have a long gray beard, they would still speak to him as the boy. After the horses and wagons had been attended to, they had all washed up, they went down again into the common room and dined. The meal certainly didn't match up to Aunt Paul's, but it was a welcome change from turnips. Garon was absolutely certain that he would never be able to look at a turnip in the face again for the rest of his life. After they had eaten, the men lorded over their ale pots, and Aunt Paul's face registered her disapproval. Garon and I are going to bed now, she said to them. Try not to fall down too many times when you come up. Wolf, Berrick, and Silk laughed at that, but Durkin, Garon thought, looked a bit shamefaced. The next day, Mr. Wolf and Silk left the inn early and were gone all day. Garon had positioned himself in a strategic place in hopes that he might be noticed and asked to go along, but he was not. So when Durkin went down to look after the horses, he accompanied him instead. Durkin, he said after they had fed and watered the animals, the smith was examining their hooves for cuts or stone bruises. Does all this seem strange to you? Durkin carefully lowered the leg of the patient horse he was checking. All of what, Garon? He asked, his plain face sober. Everything, Garon said vaguely. This journey, Bark and Silk, Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul, all of it. They all talk sometimes when they don't think I can hear them. They all seems terribly important, but I can't tell if we're running away from someone or looking for something. It's confusing to me as well, Garon, Durkin admitted. Many things aren't what they seem, not what they seem at all. Does Aunt Paul seem different to you? Garon asked. What I mean is, they all treat her as if she were some noblewoman or something. And she acts differently, too, now that we're away from Falder's farm. Mistress Paul is a great lady, Durkin said. I have always known that. His voice had the same respectful tone it always had when he spoke of her, and Garon knew that it was useless to try to make Darren perceive anything unusual about her. And Mr. Wolf, Garon said, trying another track. I always thought he was just an old storyteller. He doesn't seem to be an ordinary Vandabog, Durkin admitted. I think we've fallen in with important people, Garon, on important business. It's probably better for simple folks such as you and I to not ask many questions, but to keep our eyes and ears open. Will you be going back to Falder's farm when this is all over? Garon asked carefully. Durkin considered that and looking across the rain-swept courtyard in the inn. No, he finally said in a soft voice. I'll follow as long as Mistress Paul allows me. On an impulse, Garon reached over and patted the smith's shoulders. Everything is going to turn out for the best, Durkin. Durkin sighed. Let's hope so, he said, and turned his attention back to the horses. Durkin, Garon asked, did you know my parents? No, Durkin said. The first time I saw you, you were a babe in Mistress Paul's arms. What was she like then? She seemed angry, Durkin said. I don't think I've ever seen anyone quite so angry. She talked with Falder for a while, and then to work in the kitchen. You know Falder. He never turned anyone away in his life. At first, she was just a helper, but that didn't last too long. Our old cook was getting fat and lazy, and she finally went off to live with her younger daughter. After that, Mistress Paul ran the kitchen. She was a lot younger then, wasn't she? Garon asked. No, Durkin said thoughtfully. Mistress Paul never changes. She looks exactly the same now as she did the first day. I'm sure it only seems that way, Garon said. Everybody gets older. Not Mistress Paul, Durkin said. That evening, Wolf and his sharp-nosed friend returned, their faces somber. Nothing, Wolf announced shortly, scratching at his snow beard. I might have told you that, Aunt Paul sniffled. Wolf gave her an irritated look, then shrugged. We had to be certain, he said. The red-bearded giant looked up from the mail shirt he was polishing. Not a trace at all? He asked. Not a hint, Wolf said. He hasn't gone through here. What then now? Bark said, setting his mail shirt aside. Maros, Wolf said. Barak rose and went to the window. The rain is slacking, he said, but the roads are going to be difficult. We won't be able to leave tomorrow anyway, Silk said, lounging on a stool near the door. I have to dispose of our turnips. If we carry them out of Durnan with us, it will seem curious, and we don't want to be remembered by anyone who might have an occasion to talk with anyone during Margot. I suppose you're right, Wolf said. I hate to lose the time, but there's no help for it. The roads will be better after a day of drying, Silk pointed out, and wagons travel faster empty. Are you sure you can sell them, friend Silk? Durkin asked. I'm a Desarian, Silk said confidently. I can sell anything. We might even make a good profit. Don't worry about that, Wolf said. The turnips have served their purpose. All we need to do now is get rid of them. It's a matter of principle, Silk said airily. Besides, if I don't try to strike a hard bargain, that would be remembered. Don't be concerned, the business won't take long and it won't delay us. Can I go along with you, Silk? Garon asked, hopefully. I haven't seen any part of Denarian except for the Sin. Silk looked inquiringly at Aunt Paul. She considered for a moment. I don't suppose it would do any harm, she said, and it will give me time to attend to some things. The next morning, after breakfast, Silk and Garon set out with Garon carrying a bag of turnips. The small man seemed to be in extraordinarily good spirits, and his long pointed nose seemed almost to quiver. The whole point, he said as they walked along the littered cobblestone streets, is not to appear too eager to sell, and to know the market, of course. That sounds reasonable, Garon said politely. Yesterday I made a few inquiries. Silk went on. The turnips are selling on the docks of Courtier and Desarian for a Desarian silver link per hundredweight. A what? It's a Desarian coin, Silk explained. About the same as a silver imperial. Not quite, but close enough. The merchant will try to buy our turnips for no more than a quarter of that, but he'll go as as half as high. How do you know that? It's customary. How many turnips do we have? Garen asked, stepping around a pile of refuse in the street. We have 30 hundredweight, Silk said. That would be... Garen's face contorted in an effort to make the complex calculation in his head. 15 imperials, Silk supplied, or 300 crowns. Gold crowns. Gold? Garen asked. Because gold coins were so rare in country dealings, the world seemed to have an almost magical quality. Silk nodded. It's always preferable, he said. It's easier to carry. The weight of silver becomes much burdensome. And how much should we pay for the turnips? 5 imperials. Silk said. The farmer gets 5, we get 15, and the merchant gets 30. Garen asked incredulously. That seems hardly fair. Silk shrugged. It is the way of things are, he said. There's the merchant's house. He pointed at a rather imposing building with broad steps. When we go in, he'll pretend to be very busy and not interested in all. Later, while he and I are bargaining, he'll notice you and tell you what a splendid boy you are. Me? He'll think you're some relation of mine, a son or nephew, perhaps. He'll think to gain advantage over me by flattering you. What a strange notion, Garen said. I'll tell him many things, Silk went on, talking very rapidly now. His eyes seemed to glitter, and his nose was almost twitching. Pay no attention to what I say, and don't let any surprise show on your face. He'll be watching us both very carefully. Are you going to lie? Garen was shocked. It is expected, Silk said. The merchant will always also lie. The one of us who lies the best will get the better of the bargain. It seems terribly involved, Garen said. It is a game, Silk said, his ferret-like face breaking into a grin. A very exciting game that's all played all over the world. Good players get rich and bad players don't. Are you a good player? Garen asked. One of the best, Silk replied modestly. Let's go in. And he led Garen up the broad steps to the merchant's house. The merchant, who wore an unbelted fur-trimmed gown of a pale green color and a close-fitting cap. Excuse me. Gotta love tracking when you're drinking. Go Bart. He behaved as much as Silk had predicted that he would, sitting before a plain table, leafing through many scraps of parchment with a busy frown on his face, while Garen and Silk waited for him to notice them. Very well, then, he said finally. You have business with me? We have some turnips, Silk said somewhat disrespectfully. That is unfortunate, friend, the merchant said, assuming a long face. The wharves at Covier grown with turnips just now. It would hardly pay me to take them off your hands at any price. Silk shrugged. Perhaps the Cherokees or the Algars, then. Their markets may not yet be so glutted as yours. He turned. Come along, boy, he said to Garen. What do you mean I'm late? I am not late, you are. Nah. It's like, I'm not late, you are. Nah. Time is relative. I'm gonna have so much fun with this. Sorry. You will slap me? Good luck. I enjoyed myself. While taking a drink. A moment, good friend, the merchant said. I detect from your speech that you and I are countrymen. Perhaps, as a favor, I'll look into your turnips. Your time is valuable, Silk said. If you aren't in the market for turnips, why should we trouble you further? I might still be able to find a buyer somewhere, the merchant protested, if the merchandise is of good quality. He took the bag from Garon and opened it. Garon listened with fascination as Silk and the merchant fenced politely with each other, each attempting to gain the advantage. What a splendid boy this is, the merchant said, suddenly seeming to notice Garon for the first time. I'm gonna need a snack after. An orphan, Silk said, placed in my care. I'm attempting to teach him the rudimentaries of business, but he's slow to learn. The merchant said, sounding slightly disappointed. Then the Silk... What? Again, I'm going to be in trouble with this I'm going to be in trouble with this tracking, okay? It's so cute. No! Not cute. Oh, I can't do the blush. Mm-mm. 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 Not cute. No. I refuse. Mm-mm. No. 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 Mm-mm. Mm-mm. I know I'm not helping my case. I'm not. No. Let me check my battery real quick. Perfect. Is that demon shit? Wow! Someone's sticking their own fucking hole today, besides myself. I don't think I could, like, honestly, I don't think I could, like, growl. Like, I can growl if I really wanted to, but it would fucking, my throat would be like, squeaky sounds. I squeak. I also pterodactyl screech. But I have not had it again. So I know we're kind of whenever I am in the store with my best friend IRL, and sometimes with my husband, if I can't find him or I cannot find her, we will just pterodactyl screech in public. We're all so loud that we can generally, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. There's little one screech. Wait a minute. There's husband. Unholy. I'm going to stab you. I'm going to fucking stab you, sir. Unholy sounds of a dying animal? Wow. Do it, you won't. Technically, I just have to wait for permission, and then I can stab you and make you bleed, so... And sounds of an unholy dying animal. Fuck you. Keep doing it, Unity. The more you do it, the more I get to stab you. No, pterodactyl screech is my unholy sound, okay? That's my unholy sound. And I haven't had a need to do my pterodactyl screech. It's always funny. Oh no. Oh. Oh no. just saw them. All the fucking puns. But, he... Hi, Axe. How you doing, hun? The instant turn. I'm like, I'm plotting to. Hi. No. Don't do this shit. No. Bite me. I'm not gonna bite you. I'll stab you. I'm doing good. How you doing, hun? Sorry. My brain is just going. My brain just got derailed, okay? My brain just went. You know, squirrel brain. But no, I don't think my mic would be able to pick up my pterodactyl screech anyways. So, yeah. That's never gonna happen on stream. Unless I, like, really... Derailing, not railing. Desmond. Sorry. That's derailing. That I'm listen. Where the fuck is my knife? I'm gonna stab you. Idiot. Don't be. No. You have to wait. I'm very good at that. Honey, I am extremely good at waiting, especially to stab people. Even if I get distracted by Shiny, I remember. I'm like, haha, I can stab. Stab, stabby. Need to go stop. Okay. Back on track. I'm looking. Uh-huh. Then Silk made a curious gesture with the fingers of his right hand. The merchant's eyes widened slightly. Then he too gestured. After that, Garen had no idea what was going on. The hands of Silk and the merchant wove intricate designs in the air, sometimes flickering so rapidly that the eye couldn't scarcely follow them. Silk's long, slender fingers seemed to dance, and the merchant's eyes were fixed upon them, his forehead breaking into sweat of the intensity of his concentration. Done then? Silk said finally, breaking the long silence in the room. Done, the merchant said somewhat ruefully. It's always been a pleasure doing business with an honest man, Silk said. I've learned much today, the merchant said. I hope you don't intend to remain in this business for long, friend. If you do, I might as well just give you the keys to my warehouse and strong room right now and save myself the anguish I'll experience every time you appear. Silk laughed. You have been a worthy opponent, merchant friend, he said. I thought so at first, the merchant said, shaking his head. But I am no match for you. Deliver your turnips to my warehouse on Bernadette Wharf tomorrow morning. He scratched a few lines on a piece of parchment on a quill. My overseer will pay you. Silk bowed and took the parchment. Come along, boy, he said to Garon, and led the way from the room. What happened? Garon asked when they were outside the Bolstery Street. You got the price I wanted, Silk said, somewhat smugly. But you didn't say anything, Garon objected. We spoke at great length, Garon, Silk said. Weren't you watching? All I saw were you two wagging your fingers at each other. That is how we spoke, Silk explained. It's a separate language my countrymen devised thousands of years ago. It is called the secret language, and is much faster than the spoken one. It also permits us to speak in the presence of strangers without being overheard. An adept can conduct business while discussing the weather, if he chooses. Will you teach it to me? Garon asked, fascinated. It takes a long time to learn, Silk told him. Isn't the trip tomorrow likely to take a long time? Garon suggested. As you wish, he said. It won't be easy, but it'll help pass the time, I suppose. Are we going back to the inn now? Garon asked. Not right away, Silk said. We need a cargo to explain our entry into Moros. I thought we were going to leave with the wagons empty. We are, but you just said. We'll see a merchant I know, Silk explained. He buys farm goods all over Sindarian and has them held at farms until the markets are right in Andrian and Toldarian. Then he arranges to have them freighted in either to Moros or Camir. It sounds very complicated, Garon said doubtfully. It's not really, Silk assured him. Come along, my boy, you will see. The merchant was a Toldarian who wore a flowing blue robe and a disdainful expression on his face. He was talking with the grim-faced Margot as Silk and Garon entered his counting room. The Margot, like all his race Garon had ever seen, had deep scars on his face, and his black eyes were penetrating. Silk touched Garon's shoulder with a cautionary hand when they entered and saw the Margot. Then he stepped forward. Forgive me, noble merchant, he said ingratiatingly. I didn't know you were occupied. My porter and I will wait outside until you have time for us. My friend and I will be busy for most of the day, the Toldarian said. Is it somewhat important? I was just wondering if you might have a cargo for me, Silk replied. No, the Toldarian said shortly. Nothing, he said, turning back to the Margot, then stopped and looking sharply at Silk. Aren't you Amber of Kortar? He said. I thought you dealt in spices. Garon recognized the name Silk had given the merchant at the gates of the city. It was evident that the little man had used the name before. Alas, Silk said, my last venture lies at the bottom of the sea, just off the hook of Andarian. 2 shiploads bound for Tol Hothen. A sudden storm, and I am a pauper. A tragic tale, worthy number, the Toldarian merchant said, somewhat smugly. I am now reduced to freighting produce, Silk said, morsely. I have 3 rickety wagons, and that's all that's left of the Empire of Amber Quarter. Reverses come to us all, the Toldarian said, philosophy. So this is the famous Amber of Kortar, the Morgar said, his harshly accented voice quite soft. He looked up at Silk up and down, his black eyes probing. Was a fortunate chance that brought me out today. I am enriched by meeting such an illustrious man. Silk bowed politely. You are too kind, noble sir, he said. I am Ashrok of Rockgoshar. The Margar introduced himself. He turned to the Toldarian. We can put aside our discussion for a bit, Maynard. He said, we will accrue more honor by assisting so great a merchant to begin recouping his losses. You are too kind, worthy Ashrok, Silk said, bowing again. Garon's mind was shrieking all kinds of warnings, but the Margot's sharp eyes made it impossible to make the slightest gesture to Silk. He kept his face impassive and his eyes dull, even as his thoughts raced. I would gladly help you, my friend, Margot said. But I have no cargo and Denarian at the moment. I'm already committed for Denarian to Meldaria, Silk said quietly, 3 wagonloads of Cherokee iron, and I also have a contract to move first from Mars to Camir. It's the 50 leagues from Belgariad to Moros that concern me. Wagons traveling empty earn no profit. Moldaria, Mingar frowned. Let me examine my records. It seems to me that I do have something there. He stepped out of the room. Your exploits are legendary in the kingdoms of the East, Ambar. Ashrak Agorak said admiringly, when last I left Kal Marthor Koth Mogars, there was still set a keenly price on your head. Silk laughed easily. A minor misunderstanding, Ashark, he said. I was merely investigating the extent of Toldarian intelligence gathering activities in your kingdom. I took some chances I probably shouldn't have, and the Toldarians found out what I was up to. The charges they leveled at me were fabrications. How did you manage to escape? Ashark asked. The soldiers of King Tar-Unas nearly dismantled the kingdom searching for you. I chanced to meet a Tholish lady of high station, Silk said. I managed to prevail upon her to smuggle me across the border into Mishark Octhul. Ashark smiled, said smiling briefly. Tholish ladies are notoriously easy to prevail upon. But most demanding, Silk said. They expect full repayment of any favors. I found it more difficult to escape from her than I did of Koth Morgar. Do you still perform such services for your government? Ashark said casually. They don't even talk to me, Silk said with a gloomy expression. Ambar, the spice merchant, is useful to them, but Ambar, the poor wagoner, is quite another thing. Of course, Ashark said, and his tone indicated that he obviously did not believe what he had been told. He glanced briefly and without seemingly interest at Garan, and Garan felt a strange shock of recognition. Without knowing exactly how it was that he knew, he instantly knew for sure that Ashraq of Rock Gashar had known him for all of his life. There was a familiarity in the glance. A familiarity that had grown out of a dozen times, and more that their eyes had met. While Garan was growing up, and Ashark muffled, always in a black cloak astride a black horse, had stopped and watched them and moved on. Garan returned the gaze without expression, and the faintest hint of a smile flickered across Akarsh's scarred face. Mingar returned to the room then. I have some hams on a farm near Malaria, he announced. When do you expect to arrive in Maros? 15 to 20 days, Silk told them. Minar nodded. I'll give you a contract to move my hams to Moros. He said 7 silver nobles per wagon load. Toldarian nobles or Sindarian? Silk asked quickly. This is Sindarian, Worthen Amber. We are citizens of the world, noble merchant, Silk pointed out. Transactions between us have always been in Toldarian coin. Minar sighed. You're very quick, worthy Amber, he said. Very well. Toldarian nobles because we are old friends, and I grieve for your misfortunes. Perhaps we'll meet again, Amber, Ashark said. Perhaps, Silk said, and he and Garan left the counting room. Skinflint, Silk muttered when they reached the street. The rate should have been 10, not silver. What about the Margot? Garan asked. Once again, there was a familiar reluctance to reveal too much about the stranger. Unspoken link that had existed between him and the figure that now at least had a name. Silk shrugged. He knows I am up to something, but he doesn't know exactly what, just as I know that he's up to something. I have a dozen meetings like that. Unless our purpose happens to collide, we will interfere with each other. Ashark and I are both professionals. You're a very strange person, Silk, Garan said. Silk winked at him. Why are you and Margot arguing about the coins? Tandarian coins are a bit purer, Silk told him. They are worth more. I see, Garan said. The next morning, they all mounted the wagons and delivered the turnips to their warehouse of the Dasarian merchant. Then, their wagons rumbling empty, they rolled out of Danarian, bound towards the south. The rain had ceased, but the morning was overcast and blustery. On the hill outside town, Silk turned to Garan, who rode beside him. Very well, he said. Let's begin. He moved his fingers in front of Garan's face. This means good morning. Essentially, it's sign language. Real quick, I'm gonna go BRB. I need to go to the bathroom real quick. Chat, behave yourselves. Have fun, mods, if they don't. I'll be back.
signs of fight or flight were in her. All was well until I tried to take her helm. Her rigging came alive, she hung my crew before me eyes. She stole my sight and cursed me captain of the shadow. She took my eyes and cursed me captain of the shadow. Lean left, hard right, steer clear of her, I fear she'll eat your soul, she'll take your life. Heave ho, till first light, she'll claim the souls of those who try to tame the shadow. None can tame the one the sailors call the shadow. None can tame the one the sailors call the shadow.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. I smell the bones of an Englishman.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. Crossbones, swords, and a bottle of rum. Heave-hi-ho, hum. No rest for the lily-livered pirate scum. From the dawning of the day to the drowning of the sun. No rest for the lily-livered pirate scum. Salt on my tongue from the spray of the sea. Drunk on the sun beating down on me. Bound for a treasure that's never been seen, where dead men lay their bones. Blood on my hands from the pull of the rope. No wind in our sails, so we have to row. And it's heave ho, or to the locker you'll go, where dead men lay their bones. Where dead men lay their bones.
Fee, fi, fo, fum. There's a bottle of rum. Hello. You do. Okay. We're gonna do one more chapter. And then we'll call it for the night. Because we're on chapter 8. I love this book so much. If you can't tell, this is like one of my favorite series. I love it so much. But chapter 8. After the first day, the wind blew itself out, and the pale autumn sun. Considering the last time that we did story time, I went from chapter 2. No, I went from chapter 1 to chapter 6 because I was a dumbass and I didn't get freaking recording from the last time. So, it also depends. This chapter, we might read 2 more and get to chapter 10. We'll see. Again, like, I literally could, if my voice wouldn't kill me, as much as I love, like, the Witcher series and stuff like that, and we are going to finish that one. Obviously, I'm bouncing between both of them. Like, it's just my love for this series that I would read this for a while, but my voice would not like me at all. At all. And I am noticing that, technically speaking, Witcher's chapters seem to technically be almost like 3 chapters in one, because the book we're on right now, they keep jumping to the past. So you have like half of the chapters in the future, like in the present, and then it goes into the past, and then it goes back. So yeah. That's why Witcher chapters take me a lot longer to read than is taking me to read the Belgariad. So yes. Their route southward led them along the Denarian River, a turbulent stream that rushed down the mountains on its way to the Gulf of Sheikh. The country was hilly and timbered, but since the wagons were empty, the horses made good time. Garin paid scant attention to the scenery as they trundled up the valley of the Denarian. His attention was riveted almost totally on Silk's flickering fingers. "Don't shout," Silk instructed as Garin practiced. "Shout?" Garin asked, puzzled. Keep your gestures small. Don't exaggerate them. The idea is to make the whole business inconspicuous. I'm only practicing, Garin said. Better to break bad habits before they become too strong, Silk said. And be careful not to mumble. Mumble! Form each phrase precisely. Finish one before you go into the next. Don't worry about speed. That comes with time. By the third day, they were conserving... Their conversations were half in words and half in gestures, and Garin was beginning to feel quite proud of himself. They pulled off the road into the grove of tall cedars that evening and formed up their usual half circle with the wagons. How goes the instruction? Mr. Wolf asked as they climbed down. It progresses, Silk said. I expect it will go more rapidly when the boy outgrows its tendency to use baby talk. Garin was crushed. Barak, who is also dismounting, laughed. I often thought that the secret language might be useful to know, he said, but fingers built to grip a sword are not nimble enough for it. He held out his huge hand and shook his head. Shiny button, huh? Thank you, Amp.
Just picked up their spell
Thank
book again for 18
you.
months. Press his shiny button.
Has it really been that long? Has it? Sheesh. Goddamn. It's been that long? Sheesh. And soon it'll be 3 years of doing this. Look at the trouble. Yes, you did cause trouble. My sister. You decided to scruff me and go like mine, and I'm like, huh? And well. Durkin lifted his face and sniffed the air. It's going to be a cold night, he said. We'll have frost before morning. Barak also sniffed. And then he nodded. You're right, Durkin, he rumbled. We'll need a good fire tonight. He reached into the wagon and lifted out his axe. Let's go, Amfred! I'm not distracted, squirrel brain. No. There are riders coming, Aunt Paul announced, still seated on the wagon. They all stopped talking and listened to the faint drumming sound on the road they had just left. 3 at least, Bark said grimly. He handed the axe to Durkin and reached back into the wagon for his sword. 4, Silk said. He stepped onto his own wagon and took his own sword from under the seat. We're far enough from the road, Wolf said. If we stay still, they'll pass without seeing us. That won't hide us from golems, Aunt Paul said. They won't be searching with their eyes. She made 2 quick gestures to Wolf, which Garin did not recognize. No, Wolf gestured back. Let us instead. He also made an unrecognizable gesture. Aunt Paul looked at him for a moment and then nodded. All of you stay quiet, Wolf instructed them. Then he turned towards the road, his face intent. Garin held his breath. The sound of galloping horses grew nearer. Then a strange thing happened. Though Garin knew he should be fearful at the approaching riders and the threat they seemed to pose, a kind of dreamy lethargy fell over him. It was as if his mind had quite suddenly gone to sleep, leaving his body still standing there watching incredulously the passages of those dark mantled horsemen along the road. How long he stood so he was not able to say, but when he roused from his half-dream, the riders were gone and the sun had set. The sky to the east had grown purple with approaching evening, and there were tatters of sun-stained clouds along the western horizon. Margot's, Aunt Paul said calmly, and one Gorlam. She started to climb down from the wagon. There are many Margots in Sindarian, great lady, Silk said, helping her down, and on different missions. Margots are one thing, Wolf said grimly. Golems are quite something else. I think it might be better if we moved off the well-traveled roads. Do you know a back way to Belgariad? Old friend, Silk replied modestly. I know a back way to every place. Good, Wolf said. Let's move us deeper into these woods. I prefer if no chance gleam from our fire reached the road. Garin had seen the clothed Margos only briefly. There had no way to be sure if one of them had been the same Akash he had finally met after all these years of knowing him only as a dark figure on a black horse, but somehow he was almost certain that Ashrak had been among them. Ashrak would follow him, would be there whenever he went. It was kind of one thing one could count on. Durgan had been right when he had spoke of frost. The ground was white with its next morning, and the horse's breath steamed in the chill air as they set out. They moved along lanes and little-used tracks that were partially weed-choked. The going was slower than it might be if they had been on the main road, but they all felt much safer. It took them 5 more days to reach the village of Windor, some 12 leagues of the north of Mildira. There, at Aunt Paul's insistence, they stopped overnight at a somewhat run-down inn. "I refuse to sleep on the ground again," she announced flatly. After they had eaten in the dingy common room of the inn, the men turned to their ale pots, and Aunt Paul went up to her chamber with instructions that hot water be brought for her bathing. Garin, however, made some pretext about checking the horses and went outside. It was not that he was in the habit of being deliberately deceptive, but it had occurred to him in the last day or so that he had not a single moment alone since they had left Father's farm. He was not by nature a solitary boy, but he had begun to feel quite keenly the restrictions of always being in the presence of his elders. The village of Wendola was not a large one, and he explored it from one end to the other in less than half an hour, loitered along its narrow cobblestone streets in the crispness of the early evening air. The window of the houses glowed with golden candlelight, and Garin suddenly felt a great surge of homesickness. Then at the next corner of the crooked street, in the brief light from an opening door, he saw a familiar figure. He could not be positive, but he shrank back against a rough stone wall anyway. The man at the corner turned in irritation toward the light, and Garin caught the sudden white gleam from the one of his eyes. It was Brill. The unkempt man moved quickly out of the light, obviously not wishing to be seen, then he stopped. Garin hugged the wall, watching Brill's impatient pacing at the corner. The wisest thing would have been to slip away and hurry back to the inn. But Garin quickly dismissed the idea. He was safe enough here in the deep shadows behind the wall, and he was too caught up at curiosity to leave without seeing exactly what Brill was doing here. After what seemed several hours, but was really only a few more minutes, another shadowy shape came scurrying down the street. The man was hooded, and so it was impossible to see his face. But the outline of his form revealed a figure dressed in the tunic, horse, and calf-length boots of an ordinary Sindarian. There was also, when he turned, the outline of a sword belted at his waist, and that was far from ordinary. While it was not precisely illegal for Sindarians of the lower class to bear arms, it was uncommon enough to attract attention. Garin tried to edge closer enough to hear what Brill said to the man with the sword, but they spoke only briefly. There was some clink of some coins, changed hands, and the two separated. Brill moved quietly off round the corner, and the man with the sword walked up the narrow, crooked street towards the spot where Garin stood. There was no place to hide, and as soon as the hooded man came closer, he would be able to see Garin. To turn around and run would be even more dangerous. Since there was no alternative, Garin pulled out a bold front and marched determinedly toward the oncoming figure. "Who's there?" the hooded man demanded, his hand going to his sword hilt. "Good evening, sir," Garin said, deliberately forcing his voice up into a squeaky registers of a much younger boy. "Cold night, isn't it?" The hooded man grunted and seemed to relax. Garin's leg quivered with the desire to run. He passed the man with the sword, and his back prickled as he felt the suspicious gaze follow him. "Boy," the man said sharply. Garin stopped. "Yes, sir?" he said, turning. "Do you live here?" "Yes, sir," Garin lied, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "Is there a tavern nearabouts?" Garin had just explored the town, and he spoke confidently, sir. "Yes, sir," he said. "If you go up the street to the next corner and turn your left, there are torches out front. You can't miss it." "My thanks," the hooded man said shortly, and walked up the narrow street. "Good night, sir," Garin called after him, made bold by the fact that the danger seemed to pass. The man did not answer, and Garin marched down the corner, exhilarated by his brief encounter. Once he was around the corner, however, he dropped the guise of a simple village boy and ran. He was breathless by the time he reached the inn, and burst into the smoky common room where Mr. Wolf and the others sat, talking by the fire. At that last instant, realizing that to blurt out his news in the common room where others might overhear might be a mistake, He forced himself to walk calmly to where his friends sat. He stood before the fire as if forming himself and spoke in a low tone. I just saw Brill in the village, he said. Brill? Silk asked. Who's Brill? Wolf frowned. A farmhand with too much Gark coin in his purse to be entirely honest. He said quickly. He told Silk and Bark about the adventures at Folder's stable. You should have killed him, Barrack rumbled. This isn't Shirk, Wolf said. Sandaris are touchy about casual killings. He turned to Garon. Did he see you? He asked. No, Garon said. I saw him first and hid in the dark. He met another man and gave him some money, I think. The other man had a sword. Sword? Wow. Briefly, he described the whole incident. This changes things, Wolf said. I think we will leave earlier in the morning than we planned. It wouldn't be too hard to make Brill lose interest in us, Durkin said. I could probably find him and hit him on the head a few good times. Tempting, Wolf grinned. But I think it might be better to just slip out of town early tomorrow morning and leave him none the notion that we've ever been here. We really don't have the time to start fighting with everyone we come across. I'd like a closer look at the sword-carrying Sindarian, however, Silk said, rising. If it turns out that he's following us, I'd rather know what he looks like. I don't like being followed by strangers. Discreetly, Wolf cautioned. Silk laughed. Have you ever known me to be otherwise? He asked. This won't take long. Where did you say the tavern was, Garon? Garon gave him the directions. Silk nodded, his eyes bright and his long nose twitching. He went quickly across the smoky common room and out into the chilly night. I wonder, Bart considered. If we're being followed this closely, wouldn't it be better to discard the wagons and this tiresome disguise, buy good horses, and simply make straight for Margos at a gallop? Wolf shook his head. I don't think the Margos are all that certain where we are, he said. Brill could be here for some other dishonesty, and we would be foolish to start running from shadows. Better just to move on quietly, even if Brill is still working for the Margos. I'd rather just slip away and leave them all beating the bushes here in central Sindaria. He stood up. I'm going to step upstairs and let Paul know what happened. He crossed the common room and mounted the stairs. I don't like it, Barrack muttered, his face dark. They sat quietly, waiting for Silk's return. The fire popped and Garon's started slightly. It occurred to him that as he waited that he had changed a great deal since they left Falder's farm. Everything had seemed simple then, with the world neatly divided into friends and enemies. In the short time they had left, however, he began to perceive complexities that he hadn't imagined before. He had grown weary and distrustful and listened more frequently to the interior voice that always advised caution, if not outright guile. He also learned not to accept anything at face value. Briefly, he regretted the loss of his former innocence, but the dry voice told him that such regret was childish. Then Mr. Wolf came back down the stairs and rejoined them. About a half hour, Silk returned. Thoroughly disputable-looking fellow, he said, standing in front of the fire. My guess is that he's common footpad. Brell's seeking his natural level, Wolf observed. If he's still working for the Margos, he's probably hiring ruffians to watch for us. They'll be looking for 4 people on foot. However, not 6 in wagons. If we can get out of Windworld early in the morning, I think we can elude them altogether. I think Durkin and I should stand watch tonight, Bark said. Not a bad idea, Wolf agreed. Let's plan to leave about the 4th hour after midnight. I'd like to have 2 or 3 leagues of back roads between us and this place when the sun comes up. Garon scarcely slept that night. When he did, there was a nightmare of a hooded man with a cruel sword chasing him endlessly down dark, narrow streets. When Bark woke them, Garon's eyes felt sandy and his head was thick from the exhausting night. Aunt Paul carefully drew the shutters in their chamber before lighting a single candle. It's going to be colder now, she said, opening the large bundle she had him carry up from the wagons. She took out a pair of heavy woolen hose and a winter boots lined with lamb's wool. Put these on, she instructed. Garon, and your heavy cloak. I am not a baby anymore, Aunt Paul, Garon said. Do you enjoy being cold? Well, no, but... He stopped, unable to think of any words to explain how he felt. He began to dress. He could hear the faint murmur of the others talking softly in the adjoining chamber in that curious, hushed tone that men always assume when they arise before the sun. We're ready, Mrs. Paul. Silk's voice came through the doorway. Then let's leave, she said, drawing up the hood of her cloak. The moon had risen late in the night and shone brightly at the frost-silvered stones outside the inn. Durkin had hitched the horses to the wagons and had led them out of the stables. We'll lead the horses out to the road, Wolf said quietly. I see no need of rousing the villagers as we pass. Silk again took the lead, and they moved slowly out of the vineyard. The fields beyond the village were white with frost, and the pale smoke-looking moonlight seemed to have leached all color from them. As soon as we were well out of earshot, Wolf said, climbing up into his wagon, let's put some significant distance between us and this place. The wagons are empty, and a little run won't hurt the horses. Truly, Silk agreed. They all mounted their wagons and set off at a walk. The stars glittered overhead in the crisp, cold sky. The fields were very white in the moonlight, and the clumps of trees back from the road very dark. Just as they were on over the first hilltop, Garen looked back at the dark cluster of houses in the valley behind them. A single flicker of light came from a window somewhere, a long golden pinpoint that appeared and then vanished. Someone's awake back there, he told Silk. I just saw a light. Some people are early risers, perhaps, Silk suggested, but then again, perhaps not. He shook the reins slightly, and the horse increased their pace. He shook them again, and they began to trot. Hang on, boy, he instructed, reaching forward and slapped the reins down smartly on the rumps of the horses. The wagon bounced and clattered fearfully behind the running team, and the bitter chill air rushed at Garon's face as he clung to the wagon seat. At full gallop, the three horses plunged down into the next valley, rushing between the frost-white fields and the bright moonlight, leaving the village and its single light far behind. By the time the sun rose, they had covered a good 4 leagues, and Silk reined in his steaming horses. Garen felt battered and sore from the wild ride over the iron-hard roads, and was glad for the chance to rest. Silk handed him the reins and jumped down from the wagons. He walked back and spoke briefly to Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul, then returned to the wagon. We turn off the lane just ahead, he told them. Garen had, as he massaged his fingers, Garen offered him the reins. You drive, Silk told him. My hands are frozen stiff. Just let the horses walk. Garen clucked at the horses and shook the reins slightly. Obediently, the team started out again. The lane circling around the back of that hill, Silk said, pointing with his chin since his hands were tucked inside his tunic. On the far side, there's a copse of fir trees. We'll stop there to rest the horses. Do you think we're being followed? Garen asked. This will be a good time to find out, Silk said. They rounded the hill and drove on down to where the dark firs bordered the road. Then Garen turned the horses and moved them under the shadowy tree. This will do fine, Garen said, getting down. Come along. Where are we going? I want to have a look at the road behind us, Silk said. We'll go up through the trees to the top of the hill and see if our back trail has attracted any interest. As he started up the hill, moving quite rapidly but making absolutely no sound as he went, Garen floundered along behind him, his feet cracking the dead twigs underfoot embarrassingly, until he began to catch the secret of it. Silk nodded approvingly once but said nothing. The trees ended just at the crest of the hill, and Silk stopped there. The valley below them, with the dark road passing through, was empty except for 2 deer who had come out of the woods on the far side to graze in the frosty grass. We'll wait for a while, said Silk. If Brill and his hireling are following, those shouldn't be too far behind. He sat on his stump and watched the empty valley. After a while, a cart moved slowly along the road toward Windwall. It would look tiny in the distance, and its pace along the scar of the road seemed very slow. The sun rose a bit higher, and they squinted into the full morning brightness. Silk, Garen said in a hesitant tone. Yes, Garen. What's this all about? It was a bold question to ask, but Garen felt Silk knew well enough now to ask it. All what? What are we doing? I heard a few things and guessed a few more, but it doesn't really make any sense to me. And just what have you guessed, Garen? Silk asked, his small eyes very bright in his unshaven face. Something's been stolen, something very important, and Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul and the rest of us are trying to get it back. All right, Silk said, that much is true. Mr. Wolf and Aunt Paul are not at all what they seem to be, Garen went on. No, Silk agreed, they aren't. I think they can do things other people can't do, Garen said, struggling with the words. Mr. Wolf can follow this thing, whatever it is, without seeing it. And last week in the woods when the Margos passed, they did something. I don't even know how to describe it, but it was almost as if they reached and put my mind to sleep. How did they do that? And why? Silk chuckled. You are a very observant lad, he said. Then his tone became more serious. We're living in momentous times, Garen. The events of 1,000 years and more have all focused on these very days. The world, I'm told, is like that. Centuries pass when nothing happens, and then in a few short years, events of tremendous importance take place, that the world is never the same again. I think if I had my chance, I'd prefer one of those quiet centuries, Garen said grumpily. Oh no, Silk said, his lips drawing back into a ferret-like grin. Now is the time to be alive, to see it all happen, to be a part of it. That makes the blood race, and each breath is an adventure. Garen let that pass. What's this thing we're following, he asked. It is best that you don't even know its name, Silk told him seriously, or the name of the one who stole it. There are people trying to stop us, and what you don't know, you can't reveal. I'm not in the habit of talking to Margos, Garen said stiffly. It is not a necessity to talk to them, Silk said. There are some among them who can reach out and pick the thoughts right out of your mind. That's impossible, Garen said. Who's to say what's possible and what isn't, Silk said, and Garen remembered a conversation that he had once had with Mr. Wolf about the possible and impossible. Silk sat on the stump in the newly risen sun, looking thoughtfully down into the still shadowy valley, an ordinary-looking little man in an ordinary-looking tunic and hose and a rough brown shoulder cape with its hood turned up over his head. You were raised a Sindarian, Garen, he said, and Sindarians are solid, practical men with little patience for such things as sorcery and magic, and other things that can't be seen or touched. Your friend Durkin is a perfect Sindaria. He can mend a shoe or fix a broken wheel or dose a secret horse, but I doubt that he could bring himself to believe in the tiniest bit of magic. I am a Sindarian, Garrett objected, the hint implicating that Silk's observation struck at the very center of his sense of his own identity. Silk turned and looked at him curiously. No, he said. You are not. I know a Sindarian when I see one, just as I recognize the difference between an Undarian and a Toldarian, or a Shilk and an Algar. There is a certain set of the head, a certain look about the eyes of Sindarian that you don't have. You are not Sindaria. What am I then? Garen challenged. I don't know, Silk said with a puzzled frown, and that's very unusual, since I am trained to know what people are. It may come to me in time, though. Is that Paul a Sindarian? Garen asked. Of course not, Silk laughed. That explains it then, Garen said. I'm probably the same thing she is. Silk looked at him sharply. She's my father's sister, after all, Garen said. At first I thought it was my mother she was related to, but that's wrong. It's my father. I know that now. That's impossible, Silk said flatly. Impossible? Absolutely out of the question. The whole notion's unthinkable. Why? Silk chewed at his lower lip for a moment. Let's go back to the wagons, he said shortly. They turned and went down through the dark trees, with the bright morning sunlight shining on their backs. They rode the back lanes for the rest of the day. Late in the afternoon, when the sun had begun to drop into the purple bank of clouds towards the west, they arrived at the farm where they were to pick up Mingarin's hams. Silk spoke with the stout farmer and showed him the piece of parchment Mingarin had given them in Denarian. I'll be glad to get rid of them, the farmer said. They've been occupying storage space I sorely need. That's the frequent case when one has dealings with Tundarians, Silk observed. They are gifted at getting a bit more than they pay for, even if it's only the free use of someone else's storage sheds. The farmer glumly agreed. I wonder, Silk said, as if though it was just a thought had just occurred to him. I wonder if you might seen a friend of mine, Brill by the name. A medium-sized man with black hair and a beard and a cast to one eye. Patched clothes and a sour disposition, the stout farmer asked. That's him, Silk said. He's been about the area, the farmer said. Looking, or so he said, for an old man and a woman and a boy. He said that they stole something from his master and that he'd been sent to find him. How long ago was that? Silk asked. A week or so, the farmer said. I'm sorry to have missed him, Silk said. I wish I had the leisure to look him up. I can't for my life think why, the farmer said bluntly. To be honest with you, I don't care for much for your friend. I'm not overly fond of him myself, Silk agreed, but the truth is that he owes me some money. I could quite easily do without Brill's companionship, but I am lonesome for the money, if you take my meaning. The farmer laughed. I'll take it as kindness if you happen to forget that I asked after him, Silk said. He'll likely be harder to find even if he isn't warned that I am looking for him. You can depend on my discretion, the stout man said, still laughing. I have a loft where you and your wagoners can put up for the night, and I'll take kindly that you slept with my workers in the dining hall over there. My thanks, Silk said, bowing slightly. The ground's cold and it's been some time since we've eaten anything but the rough fare of the road. You wagoners lead an adventurous lives, the stout man said almost enviously. Free as birds with always a new horizon just beyond the next hilltop. It's much overrated, Silk told him. And winter's a thin time for birds and wagoners both. The farmer laughed, clapped Silk on the shoulder, and then showed him to where to put up the horses. The food in the stout farmer's dining hall was plain, but there was plenty, and the loft was a bit drafty, but the hay was soft. Garin slept soundly. The farm was not Felder's, but it was familiar enough, and that was the comforting sense of having walls around him again that made him feel secure. The following morning, after a solid breakfast, they loaded the wagons with Toldarian salt-crusted hams and bade the farmer a friendly goodbye. The clouds then began to bank up the west the evening before and cover the sky during the night. It was cold and gray as they set out for Margos 50 leagues to the south. Okay. Hello, my dear apprentices. Remember to like and subscribe, and also feel free to explore the library some more. I don't know what you'll find, but I'm sure it'll be fun.